وإن تساوى العملان اجتمعا وفعل أحدهما فاستمعا.
The next principle is a very famous قاعدة which we refer to as قاعدة التداخل. قاعدة التداخل. قاعدة التداخل, I think we mentioned it a few times in other classes, which is when you have multiple intentions for one particular action. So you do one action but with multiple reasons and multiple intentions. He says here, وَإِن تَسَاوَى الْعَمَلَانِ اجْتَمَعَا. وَإِن تَسَاوَى الْعَمَلَانِ. If two acts of worships are equal, اجْتَمَعَا, that they come together. Meaning, multiple actions in intention, but with one performance of the action. So the intentions are many, but the action is one. Okay? وَفُعِلَ أَحَدُهُمَا فَاسْتَمِعَا. You do it once, and that's it. That suffices. That suffices. And so he says, listen carefully. So this is اجتماع عملين من جنس واحد. To understand this principle a little bit more properly, you've got قاعدة التداخل rests upon a number of conditions. Number one, the action, the type of action is the same. Salah and salah. Okay? Salah and salah. Two salahs. Number two, the way that you do the action, the way that you perform that action is the same. You can't enter Salat al-Janazah into Salat al-Dhuhr because you don't pray them in the same way, right? So the first we refer to as Jins al-Salah. The second one referred to as Kayfiyat al-Salah, the manner of how you perform that action. They have to be the same. Number three is the objective behind that prayer or behind the act of worship. So the scholars of Islam say one of them has to be maqsoodun li dhatihi. One of them, the Sharia wants you to do in and out of itself because of a reward attached to it. The other one is maqsoodun li ghayrihi, meaning that it's to be performed for other reasons. Good example of that is, let's say for example, any salah, salat al-maktuba, right? An obligatory prayer. Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala wants you to perform that prayer because of that prayer itself. That prayer, there's a reward attached to it, there's obligation attached to it, you have to perform that prayer. The objective is for you to pray that prayer. What about tahiyyat al-masjid? It's not intended in and out of itself. Maqsoodun li ghayri. It's intended for other reasons. What is the other reason? The Prophet ﷺ said, فَلَا يَجْلِسْ حَتَّى يُصَلِّيَ رَكْعَتَيْنِ. Don't sit up until you pray 2 units or any amount of rak'at. The purpose of it is that you don't enter the masjid without engaging in worship. So you don't enter and exit the masjid for no actual ibadah. So tahiyyat al-masjid was legislated so that you engage in worship upon your entry into the masjid. Now, right now, if you pray dhuhr with the imam, right? Have you engaged in worship upon your entry into the masjid? Yes. So you can have both those intentions. So you can have the intention of, like, for example, dhuhr, and the intention of tahiyyat al-masjid. Because one is intended in and out of itself.
So we can say
and the other one is?
Maqsoodun li dhatihi dhuhr.
Yes.
Maqsoodun li ghayrihi
is tahiyyat al-masjid. Yeah.
Objective should be same.
No. So they share the objective, which is salah. But the objective for one is that Allah Tabarak Ta'ala wants you to perform them. The other one, by the fact that you do the first one, it suffices. Okay? Because the purpose of tahiyyat al-masjid is simply
that you do not sit.
That you do not sit. And you'll be doing that by praying the Lord. Does that make sense? So it sufficed by doing both in one act of worship. This is what is referred to as tadakhul al-a'mal. Forget about the evidence because it's going to take time to try and explain, which is the evidence is the hadith of Aisha to do with tawaf and what she had to do after as a result of a hayd. But we'll just leave that. We'll just go straight to the examples of the Qawāʿid, okay? A person enters a masjid. He wants to pray rak'atay al-fajr. There's very little time left before Salat al-Fajr. He also needs to pray tahiyyat al-masjid. What does he do? Same niyyah with 2 units of prayer, and that suffices. Okay? A person enters or is in Hajj. He delays tawaf al-ifada. Before he leaves, he needs to perform tawaf al-wada'. Can he enter his tawaf al-ifada into his tawaf al-wada'? and perform only one tawaf? Yes, why can he do that?
Because the time is same.
If the type is the same, absolutely, tawaf and tawaf, but focus on, remember, the objective of each one. The Prophet ﷺ, he simply said regarding tawaf, فَاجْعَلُوا آخِرَ عَهْدُكُمْ بِالْبَيْتِ, right? They make the last thing that you do, meaning doing tawaf around the house. So with tawaf, the purpose of tawaf al-wada is not, a sort of like a separate tawaf. The purpose of it was simply, as you finish your hajj, to make sure this is the last thing that you do as you're leaving. That you go to the house of Allah and perform one last tawaf. Now, if you delay your tawaf, that happens with tawaf al-wada as well, right? So you can make the two intentions into one if it's the last thing that you're going to do, okay? So you can combine between them both. Let's look at one more example before we move on. Somebody has very little time before Salat al-Jumu'ah, and they need to make ghusl of both janaba as well as perform the ghusl before Salat al-Jumu'ah. What does he do?
Have the intention of ghusl janaba and also include that.
Ghusl al-Jumu'ah. Why is he allowed to do both together?
Because both are having the same, it's the same thing, ghusl. And also the way they perform is the same.
So the first is, the one that has a primary objective is ghusl al-janaba. Because there you're trying to remove that impurity, right? The second one is simply to have a shower before Jumu'ah.
Yes.
So it's the shower on that day. So even if it enters into your janaba, that's fine. Because it's not intended in and out of itself. It's just a time frame was given an allocated Jumu'ah, the allocated ghusl. So you can enter the two into each other. Forget about whether it's sunnah or not. The hukum, it can vary. It can vary. Yeah.
The intention is not there for both.
The intention is not that you only rewarded for one.
You have to do the.
You have to do the other, yes. So if it's wajib, you'd have to do the other. Now let's look at examples where you can't enter one into the other. Somebody missed dhuhr. Can he enter dhuhr into asr and only pray one salah? No, why not?
They are both individual and separate.
Allah Tabarak Ta'ala wants you to perform both individually. Maqsoodun li dhati. Both are maqsood li dhati. You can't do that. Somebody wants to pray the Fajr Sunnah, but time is dayiq. And he came to the masjid and people are already praying the Fajr Salah. Can he pray the intention of the Fajr Sunnah along with the Fajr prayer? Why not?
Both are separate.
Both are intended for you to pray. They both have individual rewards attached to them. Somebody made a nadhr to Allah that he was going to slaughter an animal. Okay? And then the Udhiyah season came about. And he thought, you know what, this is my opportunity to do one act of worship for the price of two. So he said, I'm going to slaughter an animal and I'm going to do my vow of slaughtering an animal. So he's going to do Udhiyah and the nadhr together, the vow. Is that sufficient? Why?
They're both different. That is, another is different.
Not times, it's to do with the intention. Allah Azza wa Jal wants you to slaughter an animal for Udhiyah, and you obligated the nadhr upon yourself. So they're both intended individually. Maqsoodun li dhatihi. So you can't put them into each other.
Even the time shape, because here it comes during the Hajj.
Yeah, but let's say the person wanted to slaughter the nadhr during Hajj. It coincide with each other, but the intentions are different. You can't enter the two into each other. A person, he finished the month of Ramadan ended and he had some days left. He said, let me fast the 6 days of Shawwal along with the qada of Ramadan. Why can't you do that?
Separate, and this is fard, and that is, you get
Not the ruling, the fard is not the issue. The maqsood is the issue. The Prophet ﷺ said that من صام رمضان ثم أتبعه ست من شوال كان كصيام الدهر. So the reward of Ramadan is completed by you fasting 6 days of Shawwal. You can't enter into each other because each one of them is intended. Ramadan is intended for you to fast. Making up is intended for you to fast. And also, the completion of that month is also something that you have to do. Qawāʿid al-Tadakhul does not work here either. Is that clear?
Is it necessary to make like the intention that this is the maqsood li dhati the other?
So yeah, you have to be a part of your intention for this to be accepted. Yes. So you'd have to intend both. You have to intend both. The Do you think that suffices, or do you want any more?
Move ahead, Shaykh. Time is short.
Okay, خلاص, we'll move on to the next one, inshallah. We'll just summarize quite quickly.
Praying the Sunnah prayer
Yeah.
of any prayer like Fajr Sunnah, but then you also intend that for the istikhara. So, can we do that?
No, because both are intended individually. So, for example, you pray istikhara, and what did you say istikhara and?
Any Fajr Sunnah or Zohar Sunnah.
Istikhara is a complicated one, Allahu Alam. I'll take it back. Allahu Alam, Allahu Alam. And it needs looking into. It needs looking into. Because istikhara sometimes is just a dua. It's a dua. And some of the ai they place istikhara in, or the dua istikhara in the salah. Whereas some of that, they even exclude the dua of istikhara from the praying time. So you're supposed to pray 2 units of prayer and then tad'u after the salah, which is, there's a khilaf amongst the fuqaha regarding. So some of them say make the istikhara dua in your tahiyyat, for example. A qawl, for example, is in your sujood, that you're supposed to ask Allah in sujood. Some of the early scholars used to say even for you do it like you do the qiyam of witr. But the point is, I don't know, I'm not certain. Allahu Alam, Allahu Alam. Needs looking into. I'll probably need to message me, inshallah. I'll look into it, inshallah. So just to conclude this qa'ida quite quickly, 2 acts of worship or more, right? They share the same common features, like the type of the prayer, how you pray them, right? One is intended for them. One is intended for you to perform objectively and primarily in and of itself, and the other one suffices by you doing one. You can enter them into each other. If they each have distinct objectives, you have to separate them in how you perform them. You can't enter them into each other. And that this principle applies to a range of different ahkam, including salah and tahara and hajj and other such examples. And we'll move on to the next qa'ida with that, bi'idhnillah.
وكل مشغول فلا يشغل مثاله المرهون والمسبل.
So the author rahimahullah ta'ala, now he moves us on to the next principle, which is al-mashghul la yushghal. Al-mashghul la yushghal. Or la yushghal even. La yushghal. What is this principle? This principle is quite simply that what is already in use cannot be used for another purpose. What is already in use cannot be used for another purpose. So he says here, وَكُلُّ مَشْغُولٍ فَلَا يُشَغَّلُ. So he says that whatever is occupied by something cannot be occupied again. Right? Is busy with something, is doing a job, it cannot be redone. Then he says, مِثَالُهُ الْمَرْهُونُ وَالْمُسَبَّلُ. مِثَالُهُ الْمَرْهُونُ. Al-marhoon comes from rahan, which is an item that is almost mortgaged for a property, is being used as collateral. Okay? So right now, for example, you borrowed a loan on something, you borrowed a loan to do something, and you've put down something of value as collateral that if you do not pay that debt, okay, that loan that you've taken out. This is referred to as al-marhoon. The item that you put down is marhoon. He's saying here that you can't do anything else with that. If it's a rahan, khalas. I can't go also and sell it to somebody as well. Because you can only do one thing with that. If you're using it as collateral for a loan, you can also not go and sell it. Does that make sense? So it's an item that is being mortgaged. He says as well, وَالْمُسَبَّلُ. Al-musabbalu. At-tasbil is al-waqf. Musabbalu. Al-waqf is defined as, they define it as tasbil al-asl, وانتفاع بالفرع, or things like that, as they say in the books of fiqh. So tasbil al-asl, they mean by it is habs al-asl. So the very grounds that it's on is an endowment, a waqf. It's being used. So if you say right now, this land is a waqf, like I'm going to make a masjid for it, you can't also turn around and sell it as well. The two won't go together. It's being used by something, it's being occupied by something. You can't do other things with it at the same time. So here he says, the explanation of it, they mention that what is dedicated for a specific use or an obligation cannot be assigned to another use or another obligation simultaneously, like at the same time. Two different time frames, or once the job of one is done, things can vary. Like a different time, other things can happen. But at the same time, one commitment stands and the other commitment would be batil. Like you would be freed from it. So you'd say al-mashghul, la yushaggal. You cannot use it for that. This applies to many different things. Al-buyu', the financial transactions, you find it in properties and other such ahkam qada'iyya and things like that. The author here mentions al-rahan and al-waqf, but you find it in other uqood as well. It comes on the ayat like Ya alladhina amanu awfu bil uqood. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said in the hadith, La yuqda ad-dayn. La yuqda ad-daynu hatta yuadda ar-rahn. And the meaning of that is, a debt is not settled up until the mortgage is fulfilled. And so you can't use a rahan to clear another debt if it's being used for that purpose, which is used for collateral for something else. So you can't have multiple usages for something that's already in use. Does that make sense? It's a very straightforward qa'ida, but we're going to quickly look at some very quick usages and we'll just move on to the next qa'ida bi'idhnillahi tabaraka wa ta'ala. So the fuqaha, we already mentioned a mortgaged item. Right? You cannot use that for another loan. A rahan is being used by somebody for a rahan. I can't go and use that for another dayn for a rahan. Does that make sense? You can only use it once. Ibn Qudamah rahimahullah ta'ala says, وَمَنْ رَهَنَ عَيْنًا بِدَيْنٍ فَلَا يَجُوزُ لَهُ فَلَا يَجُوزُ أَنْ يَرْهَنَهَا فِي دَيْنٍ آخَرَ حَتَّى يُوَفَّى الْأَوَّلِ. So you can't use it as collateral twice. You can only use it once. The waqf as well, they say that if you've dedicated a house or a property or whatever as a waqf for the poor, for a masjid, whatever, you can't also sell it, gift it, pass it on. Even if you can't give it as inheritance. None of that is allowed. Why? Because it's already being used for one purpose, which is the waqf, and you can't reassign that. And so the Prophet ﷺ said, لا يباع ولا يورث ولا يوهب. And the fuqaha as well, the statements regarding this are many. Shaykh al-Islam says, إذا صار الشيء وقفا فلا يخرج عن ملك الواقف فلا يتصرف فيه. That's it. Once you've dedicated something as an endowment, as a waqf, it doesn't leave you that being from under your ownership. You can't do anything with that again. You can't sell it, you can't gift it, you can't do anything with it. So there's no other usage to that besides it being a waqf. So basically think carefully before you do that. Somebody rented a property from somebody, a landlord. You went and rented a property from a landlord. Okay? That property is now in your name, you're renting it. You're living in it right now. He decides to rent it to another person. What's the hukum of that second rent? No voice. Batil. It's already being used as rent. You can't do that twice. Shaykh Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah says in his Alam Muqa'in, إذا كان العقد ساريا فلا يعقد آخر على ما تم تخصيصه به. You can't redo the same aqd on the very same property. And that is what this qa'id al-mashghul la yushghal is. You can't rent one property to two people. It doesn't make sense. Okay? He's got to be one.
But if the first contract is made on the basis that it is allowed for you.
How would that work?
Like in Dubai, they do this.
No, what they do, for example, is like you can have a contract on a room, for example, and then another room as well is left vacant where you can have multiple people living in one property. Right? That makes sense. But I'm saying right now, for example, you have rented the entirety of this property. Another person comes and rents the entirety of this property. At the very same time frame that you're renting it. That's practically impossible.
Two different people are renting
two different things, yeah. So different things, possible. But one thing, they're all renting it the same way, that's impossible. I don't think any law would allow that. Wallahu a'lam. I don't think it doesn't make sense. You can rent individual rooms and things like that. Happens all the time. It happens all the time. But not like the same thing. What do we take away from this qa'idah? An asset. So this relates to an asset, right? That is committed to something. You can't use it for another purpose up until the first commitment ends. Okay? It applies to financial commitments as well as religious commitments. We see waqf, for example, sadaqah. If you committed a land to something, for example, you can't also commit it to another thing as well. So if you've donated something, You can't also sell it. كل هذا you say مشغول لا يشغل. If somebody attempts to repurpose that initial contract to something else, what happens?
Somebody?
Huh?
Somebody again?
We say the first one is valid, the second one is invalid. And that's the ruling here that we need to learn. Al-mashghul la yushghal means that the second contract is invalid. And that's the primary rule of this qa'idah. It's to invalidate the second contract. Are there any exceptions to this rule? Are there any exceptions to this rule?
If the first contract has a condition,
Yeah, if the second use does not oppose the first contract. That sometimes does happen. For example, like right now, subleasing. One person is renting out something, a second person rents it out from something. So here you can't have two rents on one property. But how would it work? It would work by the second person renting from the first person that rented it out. So the first person rents it out, he's not doing anything with this spot, in a warehouse. A second one comes, rents it out from him. If the contract of the first person allows that, he is allowed to rent it again. So that's a exception that comes in the books of subleasing. Subleasing. But again, if only the landlord, the original renter, if he allowed it, it's allowed.
So if it's a custom of that area, is it okay?
If there's a custom?
That area, if it is
Yeah, generally speaking, for custom, but sometimes it might be a custom, but the person doesn't want that with his wealth. He doesn't want that with his asset or property that, it wants to be subleased. So then it goes back to his discretion.
So it should be necessary that he mentions in the contract or
No, if he doesn't mention it and it's allowed, generally speaking, you'd say al-'adat muhakkam. But he's sort of adi, and he's done what?
we can read if it is allowed.
Yes. If he doesn't specify and the culture generally, or the norms generally allow it, that's fine. Oh, I'm running out of time, yeah?
Yeah.
Allah, we're already out. I'll just rush through this, inshallah. The second example is if the first commitment is fulfilled, then you can move on to a second one, of course. If the aqd ended with the first one, that's it. You can have a second aqd, obviously. In some cases, you find, for example, that the Sharia does allow, in certain cases, a reassignment. So repossessing of that initial aqd. A good example is actually what you call the mosque in areas where there's ruins. So for example, let's say there's an old mosque in a city where nobody lives anymore. Right? So nobody even prays in that masjid anymore. What was the command of Umar, radiallahu ta'ala, to Mas'ud in Kufa and so on? It was to move that masjid to another area. When you move that mosque, that land that the waqf was on now becomes permissible again because that masjid was moved in its entirety. So that land, you can use it for anything else again. So it's no longer musabbal. Does that make sense? So now it's allowed to be reused, and that's probably the only exception. Ibn Abdul Barr rahimahullah ta'ala says, لا يغير الوقف إلا إذا انقطعت منفعته فيصرف إلى ما يشبهه. So you move it on to anything else. I think this concept is pretty straightforward, simple. Al-mashghul la yushghal. We move on to qa'idah number 46, which is the last qa'idah, I believe.
أحسن الله إليكم ثم قال رحمه الله ومن يؤدي عن أخيه واجبا له الرجوع إن نوى يطالبا.
ومن يؤدي عن أخيه واجبا. يؤدي عن أخيه, the one who pays on behalf of another, right? He pays on behalf of another. This qa'idah is interesting because we have to understand it in light of what it actually means, and not another interpretation, because it can. Let me just do this quickly. وَمَنْ يُؤَدِّي عَنْ أَخِيهِ وَاجِبًا is to do with the right to reclaim. So an individual had an obligation upon him to do something. We're going to see examples of it, inshallah ta'ala, but somebody goes and pays the obligation off. So for example, somebody promised he would pay for something, right? The person isn't there, you come along and you say, you know what, sahibi, I'm going to donate it expecting a reclaim. This is not what, it's not a gift, it's not charity, it's not something you're doing on his behalf. You're paying something that would have been wajib upon him to pay. Let's say it's a fine in today's day and age. That, because it's an obligation, you have the right to reclaim it. You have the right to reclaim it, which is why he refers to it as يُؤَدِّي عَنْ أَخِيهِ وَاجِبًا, that whoever fulfills an obligation on behalf of his brother, something that he would have to do, necessary for him to do anyway. What is the outcome of doing that? He says, لَهُ الرُّجُوعِ إِنَّ وَيُطَالِبًا, that you have the right to reclaim it if your intention was repayment, like you wanted it back. You weren't doing this for charitable purposes. Qawāʿid is known as مَنْ أَدَّى عَنْ غَيْرِهِ وَاجِبًا فَلَهُ الرُّجُوعِ إِنَّ وَمُطَالَبَتُهُ. Examples of it.
من أدى عن غيره واجبا
له الرجوع إن ومطالبته. So yes, paying somebody's loan. Somebody took out a loan. Say he traveled, you were living in his house. You noticed a letter come in through the post. Said, you need to pay an installment of a debt that he took out. Okay? There the fuqaha say what? If you paid it off with the intention of him repaying for you again, that he would have to repay you. Ibn Qudama rahimahullah says, من قضى دين غيره ونوى الرجوع فله ذلك. Whoever pays off the debt of another and his intention was, and this is the condition, that he has intention of what? Repayment. That the individual who paid the debt on behalf of repays him, then he has that. وَإِنَّ وَالتَّبَرُّعَ فَلَا رُجُوعَ. But if he intended for that to be almost like a gift, he was helping him, then there's no ruju'. So it depends on his intention. You could also argue that this qa'ida is an offshoot of what? الأمور بمقاصدها إنما الأعمال بالنيات. النفقة. Somebody came to you and he says, I'm looking for my husband. What are you looking for him for? He hasn't paid his financial obligations this month. I haven't seen him. You said, you know what? Here, take it. If when he comes back, he said, your wife came looking for me, she needs some money, I gave him this. Then you have the right to reclaim that as well. Shaykh al-Islam Taymiyyah rahmatullah says, yes, he mentions scenarios to do with that, including others. Let's see an easy one. Zakah. You paid somebody zakah off. Somebody needed to pay a certain amount in zakah. You decided to pay for it when you realized the amount. You have the right to reclaim with the intention.
Even if the person didn't ask you to pay on his behalf?
No, even if the person didn't ask. You have the right for reimbursement. Why though? The reason is simple. Because this thing was wajib, he would have to pay anyway. Since he would have to pay, he was going to pay that person. There's no difference between you paying you and paying that person. He was going to have to pay anyway. It was just, the process was just a little bit easier by the fact that, you simplified it for him by paying on behalf, and then that whole situation ended. Now it's just between you and him. So he has to reimburse you if that was your intention. If that was your intention.
Let's suppose that.
No, without even request. Even if he did not request it from him, you went out of your own way to pay. You'd have to repay you. Is that clear?
Yeah, and let's say if a person, I have due zakat, okay, and he pays on my behalf without telling me or anything.
Yeah.
Then he comes and reclaims it from me.
Yeah. Does this sound strange or?
It's like, what if he wanted to do it another time?
As in?
What if he had other plans?
That's not how obligations work. Obligations, generally speaking, have a set time. So zakah, it comes at a certain time frame. Does that make
Or
sense?
maybe, let's say at the same time when he paid, he did not know and I paid somewhere else.
That's not usually how these circumstances work. So for example, in the past, zakah, the way it would work is, you have what you'd call the individual would come and collect zakah. So the ruler would send individuals to come and collect zakah. Now this person comes round. He identifies all of this individual's assets, the camels, this, that, whatever. As for gold, silver, what's in your pocket, these are what is referred to as al-amwal al-Khafiyyah. I don't know how much you have in the bank. Does that make sense? So I cannot say this is how much your zakat is. This is to do with al-amwal al-zahira. So say for example, you have, I don't know, that many camels, that many cows, that many sheep. The guy that's collecting zakah, the jami' al-zakah, he comes and he basically says, this is how much zakah you need to pay. You're away. He goes to your neighbor who has a farm as well. He collects zakah from him. He says, you know what, your neighbor, he needs to pay this much, just tell him. He says, you know what, don't bother wasting time coming back again. You're taking animals to somewhere else. Just take these ones, I'll go claim it from my neighbor. Does that make sense? This is the scenario. As for what is hidden, there's no way for him to know. So the fact that you're paying, مثلا in dinar Kuwaiti, مثلا, you're paying your zakat somewhere, how would anybody else know that? هذا بينك وبين الله.
It might not be applicable now. Why? Because as I said, and for example, somebody is paying on my behalf, but he doesn't know that I'm also paying somebody, and I'm paid, for example.
No, but generally speaking, when you're talking about the public aspect of zakah, it's something that people can see and know. There's one person that comes and he collects his zakah on behalf of the government.
But this is not done today, right?
I don't. I'm not really a farmer, so I don't really have livestock. But I'm sure if you know the governments that do have like like hay'at zakat, things like that, where they exist, there is this approach to dealing with these sort of like public zakat that happens. As for individual, the hidden zakat, which is the money that is hidden in pockets, this doesn't really apply to it.
I think what you're saying is, I think this is applied there in Saudi, for example, that they know what is in your bank account or something. They deduct the zakat money and then they use it, whether you pay or don't pay. Khalas, that is.
Is that how?
I think I have heard it.
Okay, this doesn't really apply to that because this is directly just paying it. But generally speaking, this doesn't apply to like hidden wealth. That's all I'm trying to say. Yeah. So it's to do with something that is known, where there's no multiple sort of aspects to it. I don't know whether it's as applicable in today's context as it maybe was before, but Wallahu alam, in many cases this may still happen and does still happen. You find مثلا some people that are really close to each other, a very close friend, he'll go and pay your thing, expecting you to repay him. This is a very normal thing. So this is the principle of that, which is له الرجوع. And as you can see as well, this applies to multiple aspects of ibadat. It applies to zakah and other such acts of worship. We'll go through the very last principle, bi'idhnillah, and we'll stop here.
Can he only claim it at this time of problems? Like suppose I pay his loan.
Yeah.
And then I don't ask with him.
Yeah.
Please pay it back to me.
Yeah.
But when my time comes, like when my bad times are there, when I don't have any money, I tell him to pay, give me my money back. So
that still works, but it's not the principle. So there, that's not ruju'. Ruju' is reimbursement. It's you saying, I paid this, I want that. Like the exact same amount. Now the fact that there's a relationship where you're helping each other, that's very good. That occurs amongst Muslims. But that's not the obligation that he's mentioning here. The fact that two people have that level of ihsan amongst each other where they're always helping each other, that's one good thing. But the principle here is that in multiple acts of worship, what you find is, or multiple aspects is, you find obligations. Now, what is the difference between the obligation being paid directly to wherever you need to pay the obligation, or you paying somebody that paid on your behalf? The answer is simple. There is no difference. Well, that person that your friend or that close person that did that, he's doing you a favor by just paying this off right now, expecting a return. So the Sharia compensates that with him being a mandatory to compensate as well. What would happen if this didn't happen? You would have what's referred to as the juhud of these things, and that would lead to the reduction of khair amongst people. Instead of me doing something on your behalf, thinking, he's never going to help me again. So it reduces the ties, the good, and so on. So this principle is quite important, and it applies, like I said to you, enters into multiple abwab. Are we clear there? We've reached the very last qa'id, alhamdulillah, and then we'll stop bi'idhnillahi tabarak wa ta'ala. نعم.
والوازع الطبيعي عن العصيان كالوازع الشرعي بلا نكران والحمد لله على التمام في البدء والختام والدوام ثم الصلاة مع سلام شائع على النبي وصحبه والتابعين.
Here he goes on to what is known as al-wazi'. Al-wazi' is a deterrent. Al-wazi' is a deterrent. A deterrent is something that prevents you from doing something. So it stops you from carrying something out. In Islam, we have three, or did you call it three? Let's just stick to the two that he mentioned here. He mentions two types of wazi' here. You can add a third one on, which is mentioned by Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu, and some of the A'immah mention it in their books as well. So these are deterrents, the things that are put in place to prevent certain evils from happening. The two that he mentions here are al-wazi' al-taba'i. Al-wazi' al-taba'i is a natural deterrent. And this is that human nature dictates that in societies, there are things that are considered bad and good. And so because you don't want to be attached with bad things, you don't want people to look at you a certain way, you'll avoid doing that. It's like, for example, how, this is something that probably occurs probably more in some societies where certain qiyam, certain values are under attack collectively in society to try and reduce the stigmatization of that. So it's like, for example, homosexuality is bad, right? People in society think, if you're attributed with this attribute, people are going to look down upon you. Then it's like, how can we normalize this in society? Does that make sense? We refer to that in Islam as al-wazi' al-tabi'i. This is a natural deterrent. People in society are going to look at you back. Good example is, for example, a thief. Anywhere you go, a thief is considered a bad thing. If somebody says, look out for that guy, he steals, for example. Nobody wants to attach to his name. Does that make sense? So this is a natural deterrent. It's the fact that people naturally avoid, these sort of harmful actions and they don't want to be attached with it. You also have a second type of wazi', which is known as al-wazi' al-shar'i. Al-wazi' al-shar'i. And this is that Islam itself, the Sharia of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, it dictated punishments to try and reduce evils, and to try and prevent evils from occurring. هو المرتب من العقوبات في الشرعة الدينية. So it's to prevent certain evils coming by way of Allah Azza wa Jal, bring about rules and laws to try and reduce certain things like hudud and stuff like that. The last type is al-wazi' al-sultani. Al-wazi' al-sultani, which is the sort of like the government authority creating a deterrent outside the scope of the legislation of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. Uthman ibn Affan used to say, يَزَعُ اللَّهُ بِالسُّلْطَانِ مَا لَا يَزَعُ بِالْقُرْآنِ. That Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala prevents evils occurring and spreading in society by way of a ruler in a manner that the Qur'an would not even be able to do so, the speech of Allah. Because this Qur'an needs implementation and reinforcing. And so certain rules happen. And this is the meaning of what was said to be the statement of the Prophet ﷺ regarding that يَنصُرَ اللَّهُ عَزَّ وَجَلَ هَذَا الدِّينَ بِالرَّجُلِ الْفَاجِرِ. That the Prophet ﷺ said that Allah Azza wa Jal aids his deen by way of a wicked and evil individual. Even that happens. The point here is, you have these type of deterrents. What is this qa'idah about then? The qa'idah simply says, al-i'tidad bil-wazi' al-dini wa annahu bil-manzila bi-manzilat al-wazi' al-shar'i. That natural deterrents are accepted Islamically, or like sort of like the normal deterrents that exist in societies. And it's like the Islamic deterrent, meaning that the deterrents that society puts in place to try and prevent certain evils happening. So it's almost like certain stigmas that exist in societies are accepted. And so he says here, al-wazi' al-tab'i an al-isyani, that these normative and natural deterrences from sin. Not all deterrents. But right now, if there's a deterrent in, I don't know, if people start to say, if you keep a beard, you're going to be considered a terrorist and this and that. We can't consider that. We need to fight it. We need to change that. Because that opposes the Shara of Allah. That is a call to ma'asiyah. Does that make sense? But the scenario is, if those natural deterrents push towards what is khair and prevent evils coming about. Does that make sense? That Islamically we accept that. And it's like al-wazi' al-shar'i, like Islamic law. And this is with bila and Qurani, that this is without dispute. This qa'idah, like I said, is the term which prevents people from wrongdoing, exists in these two forms, and you can add the third one, which is the Muslim authority. The outcomes of this is that the natural deterrences are sufficient in many ways, and that you don't sometimes need the additional hukm al-shar'i to prevent certain evils from happening. And so, if a sin lacks a natural deterrent, meaning that society normalizes it, that's when Islamic law enforces a punish unto it. Why? To prevent it from happening and spreading and so on. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala says, وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا. We naturally were inspired to know right from wrong. The Muslim and the Kafir, there are things that, you find children are born knowing al-kadhib is not good and stealing is not good and this and that, right? And so these things don't always need, this is part of the fitrah, right? The natural disposition of insan. You don't need to create that within society for them to exist. And so these are almost like inbuilt awarenesses of certain rights and wrong, and that they exist within the human being. And so many things, the human beings, for example, they naturally avoid certain foods, for example. Like right now, for example, eating mustakhbathat, eating filth and insects and this and that. We don't need, hukm shar'i, for example, clarifying this, even though the ahkam exists. But it doesn't need a law, for example, putting in place, don't eat this and don't eat that unless you maybe live in China and Japan or something like that, where these things may be normalized. Does that make sense? But the point is that these sort of natural additional laws, they don't need to be there in essence. They are naturally within nufus nas. Okay? Certain crimes are like that as well. Kutiba alaykum al-qisas. Qisas is a very natural thing. People naturally are driven. People, out of guilt even, they look for a way to cleanse themselves of that. You find so many hadith where they are driven towards abwab at-tawbah by way of that, because that natural deterrence exists. I want to look at some maybe examples of that. So some crimes, the inflection of this, so this is almost like saying, like naturally, certain sins may not exist. But what happens in the flip side, if the wazi' al-tabi'i, the natural deterrent weakens in society. This is when, the Sharia pushes this deterrent even more to try and prevent people from normalizing these ills in society. A good example is, for example, if zina, adultery becomes dominant in a society. And so there, you need to push towards these things that weaken this occurrence of things, like, for example, strengthening the concept of the hudud and so on, because people have normalized this. Similarly, theft. If people don't know that there's a consequence to them stealing, they may do it because they feel like society doesn't really care anymore, and also there is no punishment in place. So the Sharia puts that in place. But without that, you might find that in many places, these things are not really needed so much. You might find places are safe, there's no theft, even though Islam's not there, for example, because the wazi' al-tabi'i is strong. Does that make sense? So there's many ways of using this. This taqa'id, as you can see, doesn't really have so much as a tatbiq in and out of the phrasing of how he said it himself, but it's almost like looking at things from a more sort of like a greater outlook, where you're looking at ahkam and how it is. A good example is, so ahkam, for example, eating or drinking urine and feces and things like that, and consuming them and becoming widespread in society. There is no had for it. So we don't have what is referred to as al-wazi' al-shar'i in that instance. Why is there no wazi' al-shar'i? Because it's naturally something that people avoid. What happens if they are normalized?
Then comes
Then the ruler, for example, you attach certain rules to try and deter from it. But naturally, They don't exist. Shaykh al-Islam Taymiyyah rahimahullah says, for example, الأمور التي ينفر منها الطابع فإن النفوس تمتنع منها دون احتياج إلى حد الشرعي. That matters that humans are naturally detest and keep away from, then they don't really need, a legal sort of punishment, because, automatically people will decide to keep away from it anyway. Another good example is, for example, rotten meat. People are bringing them into the marketplaces and people are selling them and buying them and things. This is a harmful thing, right? But there's no real had for that, Islamically. There is the prohibition of it. You shouldn't be eating that, but there's no real had for it, right? Maita and things like that. Are you punished for eating maita? No, you're not. But what happens if it's normalized? The deterrent has to be made stronger to avoid it being normalized.
Can we say that if الوازع الشرعي الوازع الطبعي if something which should be deterrent naturally to the people, if it becomes common in the society, then what?
So the relationship between the three, to summarize, is the number one, you have al-wazi' al-tabi'i, which is the asl. Yeah. So Allah Azza wa Jal naturally created within us, within our fitrah, the natural disposition, certain behaviors that are deemed bad to the human being and certain behaviors that they are okay. So these behaviors that are deemed bad to us, if that wazi' weakens as a result of the corruption of the heart, the Sharia installs hudud. Those hududs are to be practiced further. If there's no had, you turn towards, so the three are always complete one another. It's either the natural sort of deterrent is weak, or that this sort of munkar is not something that there's a had for because it's a very strange one. It shows how far society have reached in immorality. Or the third scenario is that the ruler just simply doesn't care and doesn't want to do anything to change that scenario. But the problem is not in understanding these things, it's to look at it from the reason why he mentioned it here is not wazi' sultani, leave wazi' sultani for a minute in that equation. Is to simply say that just because there's no had does not mean that this thing is not bad and really wrong. Just because Allah Azza wa Jal prohibited it simply means that it goes back to the nature of people to avoid, and that is one of the greatest principles of Islam. And this is also why in society, in Muslim societies, in societies in general, there is an obligation to maintain that general standards of morality and encourage the wa'adh and keep the hearts of the people alive with iman, and that certain behaviors are not normalized as a result of their neglect. And that's all that this principle deals with. Does that make sense, true? For example, lying, does it have a head? No. It does not. This is because it's something that is naturally detested by people. Even children know thing. If you have things like public nudity, you find some of the books of fiqh mention that. Public nudity doesn't have a head. But today you have laws if you publicly are nude, for example. Right? So these sort of things are what this issue speaks about. Eating dog meat, for example, repulsive, no had. This is what the author is talking about. And other such behaviors. In a nutshell, if you want to jot down a number of things, inshallah, to conclude this principle with, is to simply say that some sins, they need a legal punishment because the natural deterrent is weak. An example of that is they need the legal deterrent, had, al-wazi' al-shar'i, they need that. Why? Because the natural deterrent is weak. For example, zina, for example, there's that strong attraction that exists between the genders. They want to do that. For example, theft, النفوس عندها طمع. It wants wealth. And so it's driven to take things that is not theirs. Right? So the Sharia imposes hudud. A second you see a had, don't always think, this is what this Qawāʿid completes with. And it's a very beautiful ending of this book. He's saying every time you see a strong legal punishment, don't always think of it as it being the severity of the sin. Severity of sin is a huge part of it. But in the other side as well, it's also to do with how we were created as human beings and what we are driven to do and not driven to do. Does that make sense? So, as human beings, is also these shahawat are there as well. And because of the strength and the prevalency of that as well, these things can occur in a society. And as a result of that, the wazi' al-tabi'i, to do with shahwa, is weaker, for example, because you need marriage and all these other things, it weakens you. And as a result of that, the wazi' al-shar'i is stronger. That's the scenario. The second scenario is, which is where the wazi' al-tabi'i is stronger. And so that is to do with actions where there are no hudud. There are no legal punishments. Eating meat, rotten meat, this, that, all these different things. The wazi' al-tabi'i is stronger and the wazi' al-shar'i is weaker. Why? Because the normative state of people ordinarily is that they don't do these things. And so, the natural deterrence is strong. Eating filth is a good example of that. What remains if both of those options do not help? They say, وَالْوَازِعُ الطَّبْعِي عَنِ الْعِصْيَانِ كَالْوَازِعِ الشَّرْعِي وَالسُّلْطَانِ. That you add on the last of the trio, which is that the punishment that the Muslim ruler imposes, which is ta'zir, to prevent societal harm. And so here we look at the last of this portion of ahkam, which is a maqasid principles probably more than ever, which is that the sharia balances between ahkam shar'iyya, legal punishments and the like, and between the human fitrah as well and how we were created. And so this is also a qa'ida that you have to, as you go through fiqh, you have to remember. You don't look at every single sin and say, you know what, this seems like a really bad sin, how come there's no had? There is no had, why?
Because
people are not naturally drawn to do so. Does that make sense? Yes. And with that he completes the nadhm. Walhamdulillahi ala tamami. That all praises to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon its completion. Fil bad'i, in its beginning. Wal khitami, and its end. Wad dawami, and in continuity. ثم الصلاة مع سلام شائعي. And then after that there is praise and salutations and peace upon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his companions and to all those who follow him. Rahimahullah ta'ala rahmatan wasi'a wa askanahu al-firdaws al-a'la. It's a very beneficial nadhm, as you can see. We barely touched the surface, especially today. I tried a bit more yesterday, but today we tried to just focus on the examples. I hope it was beneficial, inshallah ta'ala. But these are principles that you have to keep with you. And if you combine between, just having a general level of istihdar, remembrance of these principles, and you study a book of fiqh with them, whereby you are able to connect between a wide range of masail and these principles, that's where you develop the malaka of fiqh, really, mastery of fiqh, as he said in the beginning of the Manẓūmat. هذا والله أعلم وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.